Hi, welcome to Communicating Effectively with Children and Young People. Okay, so what was that about? Well, hello, my name is Wendy, or I am Wendy. Actually, what is it about communication that's so important to us? Well, communication is not all about talking. Communication is how we're giving away other bits of information and how we're actually using our body language and how we're using visual indicators with signs on the wall and all sorts of different things. And communication can be quite confusing. And when it's actually confusing at times, then it's difficult to know what bits of communication we need to be listening to. So, if you're flipping through the pages of a newspaper, what stops you to make you read an article? Is it perhaps the picture, or perhaps the text, or even the headline? Well, when we're talking to children and young people, perhaps we need to consider how are we going to headline what it is that we're talking about? Are we going to be able to give them something that makes them stop and listen to us? Or is our speech just part of the general hubbub of the background noise? How are we going to create their attraction? Okay, so let's have a look at this one. Sometimes social media is going to be the better option to be able to communicate, and I'm not advocating that for schools and early years, but it is something that young people do a lot, and perhaps for certain individuals it's going to be easier for them if they're not needing to have facial contact, they're not wanting to be able to look directly at you, but they prefer instead to have communication that's slightly remote through the use of visual media. And perhaps within your own setting, you need to send letters home to parents, or you may need to receive letters from schools or from your own children. I went to a setting not too long ago that was actually a ranger setting, and they were doing free access play activities in a local park, and they'd got a group of children who were living on a travellers camp that was actually next door to the park, but the children weren't coming at all, they just didn't attend. And when they were talking to me about it and say it was really disappointing, and we were talking about, well, whether it was a cultural issue or instead perhaps it actually was beyond a cultural issue and it was a bit more than that, and I asked how the information had been sent to the travelling community, and they said, well, we sent it out in a letter from school, we sent it home in the school bags. And I had to look at the letter, and actually it was full of text and it was very close together, and there were no images there to actually be able to illustrate what it was that was happening. And on this particular activity we just set up a very simple flyer that gave an image of the park, it gave a picture of children playing, it gave a clock with a time, it had some pound coins with those that crossed out to indicate that it was free. And for those parents who didn't have English as a first language or who had never learned to read or write, all of a sudden communication was much easier for them, because they were actually able to not just look at a letter that had come home from school, but instead they were looking at something that was actually going to be visual and that could signpost them directly to where it was that they wanted to be able to go. And signposting is another sort of information that we do all the time. There's signposts all around us. I suspect if you look up, then you'll see things on the wall. If you're working and doing this course within a setting, you'll find that there's fire exits, or you'll find that there's a program of events happening. We're surrounded by visual information all the time, but mostly it tends to be verbal, and we live in a very verbal world. And as the illustrations on this slide show, there's lots of different types of verbal communication. Some is just child to child and a simple conversation. Some is a conversation where you have a teacher that's actually talking to a group of children and needing to give instructions. And the third here is actually a conversation such as you would have in a playground or a party. There's lots of noise going on all over the place. And it's hard and it's difficult for children to be able to determine whose voice they need to listen to, what it is that's going to be appropriate. But if you have a look at the picture of the teacher, she's holding up a book and she's pointing to an illustration.
Jack got upset, he would flap his ears and spin around.
So it goes back to that signposting. She's signposting the important part of what she wants to talk about. On this one, it's about considering touch. When is it appropriate or inappropriate to touch someone? We need to think about that in relation to communication as well, because it's not always easy, especially if somebody may have a visual impairment or somebody may have a sensory element to their touch and have a sensory anxiety towards being touched. We need to consider very carefully about when it's appropriate to touch somebody as a form of communication. My own daughter has a sensory sensitivity to light touch, and if she's feeling upset or if she's feeling worried, if you touch her really gently, then she gets very scared and very flustered and it hurts her. But if you put a very firm hand on her arm, and then she'll lean into you and she'll be your friend because she really enjoys a firm touch. But we need to know our children, and we also need to think about a cultural sense of touch as well. Actually, it's not always going to be appropriate to touch certain individuals. For some children, in relation to communication, it's just about how they think. And the fact that a child has thought something might mean that they believe that you understand and know what it is that they're talking about. Again, our daughter has this in abundance. If she thinks something, then she believes that we know what it is that she's spoken about. So she might have said to me as a child, "Hey mum, can I have a fiver?" And we'd say, "What's your fiver for?" And she'd say, "Oh, my school trip." But because she's thought of her school trip, she makes the assumption that actually we know what it is that she's talking about. Okay, so we've spoken about communication in a variety of different ways, how children communicate, what we need to think about in the different forms of communication. But the question that we've got now is, what other types of everyday communication can you think of that children and young people use in your setting and at home?